It's a real honour to be here at what's clearly the cutting edge of occulture. I think, could we get ourselves a round of applause, just like for us? Yeah? Because we're something amazing. This is the most amazing conference. It's a real honour to be able to speak here. So what I want to do over the course of the next half an hour is I want to kind of paint a bit of a picture. Jake gave us the opportunity to engage with the story of the solanaceous plants, those scary potato family of drugs. And we then, with Danny, we were led into this idea of like the poetry, you know, the poetry of magic. A lot of what magic is about, in my opinion, is this is like it's inhabiting poetry. Ritual is a series of inhabited metaphors. And the poetry is what a lot of it's about. So I'd like to paint a picture of a sort of broad narrative, and in terms of looking at how our community, how occultism is relevant to the 21st century, and particularly with regard to the story of psychedelic drugs. So we know that these things are essential to our magical tradition. We know that they exist within the admittedly hugely under-researched area of the scary potato family of witchcraft and the hexing herbs, although it's encouraging to find lots of practitioners today exploring carefully and sensibly that powerful territory. We know that within our tradition we have the stories of alchemy, and all the transformations that represents, both the literal chemical ones and also the internal spiritual ones, the magical ones. We also know that within our own landscape, as well as the herbs such as datura and henbane and the atropine type families, we also know that there are other plants as well. And we know that there are psychedelic mushrooms. We have some elements of the tradition of the use of amanita to the further north and the further east of where we are now. We also, interestingly, realise that also within our landscape we have the psychedelic substance, if not par excellence, then definitely one which is highly accessible and very, very potent in the form of the various forms of psilocybin mushrooms that grow on the landscape that all of us inhabit. So there's the magical Western tradition, and in the modern age, of course, we're able to look at these other traditions of what I guess all of us would recognise as magic, and we can look at things like shamanism. And when we talk about the interface between altering consciousness with substances and with techniques such as drumming and so on, we have to really talk about shamanism. It's, of course, a hugely problematic and interesting term. One might suggest that the shaman is this academic construction that's then laid on anybody who isn't you, who plays a drum and looks a bit funny. You could also argue perhaps that the shaman is by definition the crazy person with the freaky hat and the drugs of some description. That's what the shaman is. The shaman is, in some respects, something that we exoticize. You know, there are shaman over here. When I was a young budding occultist, I would read books on magic and I would be told that shamans were people who sort of didn't look like me. We had different skin coloration. They were people over there, and there was a magical tradition which was it was a motley assemble of stuff in our story, in Western magic. I guess my interest in Western magic really, he's great, isn't he? Bless him. Western magic, we have people like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So when we do that practice that Danny just led us through about this thing of orientating ourselves to the directions, I suspect many of us know things like the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, stuff like this. So a lot of this technology, a lot of the modern technology, the Kabbalah that again Danny was speaking of, is developed and brewed up in this community of this kind of fin de siècle magical order. And of course the many other orders within the wider context of Europe that I'm, as someone who's locked unfortunately into one language of English, I'm less familiar with. But I'm guessing that across the whole of the continent at that sort of time, these sorts of stories that I'm outlining happen. This particular story involves Havelock Ellis. So it involves this guy over on this side, the right-hand side as you're viewing it. There he is. He's an early sexologist in Britain. So he's someone who does a whole variety of kind of academic sort of investigative work. He does lots of writing. And probably one of the things he's most famous for these days is the fact that in 1898 he took some mescaline by the side of the River Thames, and then recorded his trip, a new artificial paradise, Mescal, a new artificial paradise. In some respects, a lot of the trip reports that we have are kind of footnotes to Havelock Ellis. You know, he writes this most beautiful, beautiful account of his experience of taking mescaline, and he also records the mescaline that he doled out to a couple of his mates, and one of whom was almost certainly the Irish poet William Butler Yeats, who was a member of the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn, like any group of friends, were kind of getting together to do this intense ritual practice, and they were also getting high, because getting high is part of the magical tradition. You had Alan Bennett and Aleister Crowley sharing a flat. What must that have been like? So Alan Bennett, this is this guy who becomes one of the first Europeans to become a Theravada Buddhist monk, and is hugely involved in getting the Buddhists to come over to Europe, and one of their first missions to the West is something that he's involved with. And of course, Aleister Crowley, we all know the story. Who's a fan of Aleister Crowley in the audience? Who quite likes a bit of... Yes, a few people. I'm not sure, it's a bit dark for me, a bit sinister. So Aleister Crowley, really, really significant figure. One might argue in some ways that he was one of the key writers to take the magical tradition from the sort of medieval and drag it kicking and screaming into the modern era. So these guys are doing their stuff. And Aleister Crowley in particular goes on, and he thinks these mind-altering substances he's very interested in. William Butler Yeats is more interested in hashish, but Crowley really quite likes the whole mescaline experience. And we know that he seems, as far as we can tell, to have kept copious notes. He certainly claims to have had a book called The Cactus, which is now unfortunately lost, which records lots of experiments with mescaline, with peyote. He did a series of public rituals in 1910 in London called the Rites of Eleusis. And this is a very, very interesting thing. So Eleusis, who here is familiar with the Alexanian Mysteries, Eleusis? A quick show of hands, I've got an idea. Thank you. So he's basing this on this kind of ancient initiatory process that happened at a temple, the Temple of Demeter. But of course, he's doing it in a style of Western magic. So he knows that he's of the time when the ideas of sort of shamanism are kind of starting to emerge into culture. But what you can see here are these quite sort of, at least ostensibly, they look like kind of stylized Masonic. We all dress up in robes, and I go over here, and you dress up in a robe, and you go over here, and then you'll say a thing, and then someone will go over here, and they'll move an object to here, and that's what you do. That's ritual drama way of changing consciousness, and that's all very well, and that's fantastic. For many people, that's very potent. And if you put mescaline in with that, the reviews of the Rites of Eleusis, because this was a public event, are such that they can be basically divided into two categories. There are those people who went there and didn't take the cup that went round that probably had the drugs in it. And they say, oh, it was really boring. It went on for ages. All these people just moving about, wailing and playing violins and lying down and standing up and doing other stuff. And then there are those people who took the drugs. And they respond more like people perhaps at a Hawkwind concert or a Grateful Dead concert. They go, oh, it was astonishing. Oh, the light show, the experience, it was amazing. So this is arguably one of the first artworks, public artworks, to have been done with the express intention that you should view this in a psychedelic state. It's quite an interesting little idea. So we wind forward a little bit in history and we get to these people. People recognize who these individuals are? Yeah, okay. So there we are in the mid-20th century. So the magical tradition definitely includes the use of substances to alter consciousness. Okay, so we can definitely establish that. And by the middle of the 20th century, we have two great encounters take place. So Albert Hofmann, despite the fact that he's a Swiss chemist, and can you imagine anyone more thorough than a Swiss chemist, he still manages to accidentally get what is still one of the most powerful psychedelic substances in the world into him somehow on the 16th of April, and then decides, well, that was a bit weird, I'll have a bit more. And he takes, and of course this is almost an archetypal story. There is some research going on at the moment that might change it somewhat, but it's an archetypal story. He discovers at the same kind of time that our species is working on the atomic bomb and all of that bullshit, this substance which is like a kind of Pluto level of activity which can radically change consciousness. And although mescaline has come into European culture from the Americas, we haven't had access to psychedelics for a long, long time. Kind of strangely. So Maria Sabina, this fantastic lady over here on the right-hand side. So she's a lady who is encountered by the Roczeń, who are a couple of people who are very interested in the idea that Gordon Roczeń, the male of the couple, he's a wealthy businessman, and his partner is a leading paediatrician. And what happens is that they realise that there's a strange thing about the relationship with mushrooms. That Gordon, who is a kind of a WASP, Anglo-American kind of guy, he says, well, mushrooms are all these weird, horrible things. And his wife, who's from Russia, says, no, we gather mushrooms, this is absolutely cool. They're interested in this, so they get really into mushrooms. They start exploring. They get an article sent to them by the poet Robert Graves, which puts them on the trail of discovering this lady. So they go in the 50s, and they go exploring the Americas, and they end up with Maria Sabina in Mexico, and she initiates them into the experience of taking psychedelic mushrooms. They then print that story. Things become rather difficult for Maria Sabina, but what this lady has managed to do, peace be upon her, is that she has reminded us that actually there's a mushroom that's psychedelic, because our culture is rather curiously disconnected from it. There's very, very little reference that we can mine historically. I definitely know this from the British context. I'm uncertain about the wider European context. Very little evidence of the use of psychedelic mushrooms in our history. But in the mid part of the 20th century, this is what happens, these two great events. So acid happens, and the psychedelic medicine, we are reminded of this. Then, of course, it explodes into culture. This idea of changing awareness and transforming awareness. We have acid in particular, over the course of the mid-latter part of the 20th century, radically reforms culture. Look at this bedroom, look at this room space. Now you can imagine taking a Victorian into this. Okay, they might have been high on opium. They might go, oh, this is brilliant. But this is, I mean, the people who went to the rites of Eleusis that Crowley did, the ones who didn't take the drugs just said, we have to sit on the floor like natives. It was horrible. This is from a completely different mindset. This is like, it's hard for us, I think, to kind of understand how fucking radical and crazy this is. And that's part of the reason, of course, why the legislation of psychedelics in particular into a situation where they could be not even used by researchers, not even used by researchers for many, many, many years. These things were considered to be tremendously powerful and tremendously dangerous. And again, I'll remind you that these substances are part of our, broadly speaking, magical tradition. So the spirit of LSD has an incursion into culture. It changes things in a big and radical way. What's interesting is that human beings, because we have magic and the ability to construct things like ritual process within us as a behaviour, but what we do as humans is that we create a system of holding the experience of LSD. So we create things like the being, we invent things like the happening. We create these sort of playful environments for grown-ups that have been rarely seen, certainly outside the ruling classes of our culture for a very, very long time. We become playful. We develop a thing called the Rock Music Festival, which is a way that you hold collectively the experience of taking LSD. And we have bands like the Grateful Dead and Hawkwind and many others for whom this substance is a sacrament, is an essential component to the ritual of being in those spaces. Oh, look, there they are. Oh, let's do this. Okay, so the other thing that's kind of happening from the magical tradition perspective over this kind of time, the sort of latter part of the 20th century, is there's a real re-engagement with, I guess, what you could call like native forms of spirituality. So these are really often, sometimes reconstruction, but very often reimagination or inspiration drawn from kind of folk sorts of traditions. They may have started off life as romantic stories. The Romantic movement spoke a lot about kind of reimagining the Druids or reimagining the witches and taking those ideas and reinvigorating those in culture, seeing those as people who were kind of in opposition to the kind of patriarchal, tedious religions of Christianity. And so paganism kind of explodes into culture. So one of the things that we as magicians, as occultists, was recognised as kind of being part of our territory, widen out into the broader scenario. And in terms of psychedelics, in terms of the substances that can radically transform consciousness, what then happens is after we've had acid, the tryptamine family, so the family that mushrooms and things are in, we have the phenethylamine family, we have Mdma, ecstasy comes into our culture, so the peyote, mescaline family, these two big families of psychedelics. There are others available at your local store. So these two, this comes into culture, Mdma comes into culture, and what do we do as a culture? Well, we respond by creating a magical ritual. We create something which is called the rave, and it has various spaces, and it has protocols, and it has dressing up, and it has a whole variety of things that happen to maintain and curate and create this magical space. Ritual music, yeah? Ritual poetry. There's a guy in the place with a bittersweet face and he goes by the name of Ebenezer Good. You know that one? There you go. What also happens? A whole bunch of other stuff happens. So over the course of, if we think of the, some people have spoken of this idea of the kind of 3 summers of love. And some people suggest that we're kind of in the 3rd one now. So if the first one was the emergence of LSD into our cultural story, and the second one was the emergence of MDMA into our cultural story, then the third one, I would suggest, the one we're kind of in now, one aspect of that is the emergence and the real deep reconnection with some of those kind of, I guess you'd call them like lineaged, entheogenic religions. So the syncretic, early 20th century evolving idea of, using ayahuasca in the form of the Daime, the Santa Daime Church, the way that it was used and continues to be used by these religious forms that have kind of flowered as a result of the meeting of African and indigenous and very often Catholic forms of Christianity. We have this not necessarily in South America, but possibly even available in one of the buildings I could see out of this window. Yeah? So these belief systems which have got at their heart substances for altering consciousness have kind of come into our culture. One of the things I can certainly report from my knowledge of the esoteric scene in Britain is that there are lots of magicians, lots of card-carrying occultists who mostly dress in black, occasionally dressing in white and doing this stuff. Yeah, so there's a crossover in terms of the community here. So ayahuasca is one of the big substances that's kind of coming into this 3rd wave, this 3rd summer of love. And of course, one has to be really thoughtful about that. Just a little brief aside here to think about, this is a special and magical medicine, and like all these magical medicines, it's a stuff. Yeah, it's a physical thing. You can buy it, you can sell it, you can trade it. All of that kind of thing goes on. And we have to be really thoughtful about, as Europeans, our relationship with how we acquire this medicine, the settings in which we use it, and how often we use it, and so on. Because the situation that Maria Sabina lived through, when she generously shared the knowledge of the mushrooms and reminded us that, frankly, they grow in our own backyard, or could grow in perhaps, I don't know, a nice warm cupboard in your house. But, for instance, that we have these medicines available to us as well. And we just need to be thoughtful about that. So I just put a little kind of call in that I don't know what is the best course of action for any individual, but we just need to be thoughtful about how we engage with those substances, particularly at this delicate time. The other entheogenic belief system that I've encountered is from the Native American church. So sometimes called the Red Path, the Camino Rojo. And this is, this is kind of 19th century use of peyote developed by the indigenous people of the Americas, which has then left those lands and is travelling far and wide. It's quite interesting actually, because the various legal protections that exist for members of the Native American Church are such that in many places they travel relatively freely around the planet with peyote. And I have a friend who's a member of the church, and I kind of said, Guy, how does this work? How do you, you've got a kind of caseload of this stuff, how does it work? And he said, well, essentially we have we're card-carrying members of the Native American Church. And I said, well, what does that mean? He said, no, I have a card, and I can show this at customs, and it basically says, let this guy through, and if you don't, here's a number in America to phone, and they will frighten you sufficiently with the might of the American state that you have to let these people through. So there are ceremonies taking place with people from the Red Path in many, 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 many places around the world. Yeah, and people get an encounter of those, and I have had many really great experiences in both of these kinds of settings. These are very often fantastic people. Of course, we're aware of how there are problems. This is just humans, of course. But considering we're dealing with tremendously powerful ways of changing consciousness, we also know that these spaces, by and large, like raves, like rock music festivals, are held by caring, loving individuals who do their best. Yeah? So the Native American Church, you can see in this illustration, it's quite hard to get pictures of peyote circles from the internet, but you'll find lots of beautiful music which you can listen to, has a particular rhythm. Same, but different. So the peyote circle, like with the work that the Santa Daime and other Ayahuasca using groups do, is set up, the space is set up in a particular way. This is it's a strongly ritualized event. There's a particular circle that's used, a particular way of making the fire. This is what people did before lasers were invented. Yeah, so there's a particular way of making the fire. The fire is swept out into beautiful glowing ashes, which are the shape of hearts, or of thunderbirds, or of the sun. Yeah? Beautiful, beautiful ceremony. 10 minutes. God, right, really? Okay. Okay, so this is kind of going back down into our stuff, because I kind of thought, well, I'm addressing a bunch of magicians. What can we bring into this story? This is the kind of broader cultural story, but so what? What does it mean to us? It means a variety of things. So this is, very briefly then, an example of some of the work that myself and Nikki and other partners have done, is to work with novel entheogenic substances. So we as magicians, we're used to dealing with spirits of various types, and we're used to creating and making ceremonies and practices to hold them. So we developed some ceremonies involving cling film and ketamine. And I hasten to add that this has nothing to do with the group that Danny spoke about earlier, who ran into terrible trouble. We were very, very safe, very, very safe, and everything was completely fine. And I'm all right now, it's good. So the ketamine, so we realised that, of course, ketamine is a dissociative, and one of the practices that we had was essentially mummifying someone, giving them loads of ketamine, and then ceremonially opening them up, as an initiatory practice. We did work, when Nikki and I wrote the book at Baphomet, we were working with synthetic 5-MeO-DMT. So this was in like 2011, 2010, something like this. And we developed a ritual system to hold that. This is before certainly I was aware of the way the Bufo was being used by other practitioners. And as you can see that over there on the right-hand side, there's an example of essentially a peyote ceremony utilising respectfully, I hope, the wisdom and ideas from these other cultures in order to create a ceremony which holds the experience. In this particular case of the use of San Pedro cactus, so another mescaline-rich cactus. So one of the things we as magicians can do is we bring our skills to bear on these novel substances, and we can create ceremonies for these other things which we know are beneficial and useful. And this is why we know they're beneficial and useful, because the other side of the third summer of love, as well as the shamans coming over doing their thing, is that we have tremendously good understanding emerging about how psychedelics in particular work. Broadly speaking, what they do is they turn down our narrative of ourself, and they allow multiple novel connections to emerge in our minds. And as magicians who believe that everything is interconnected, the brain like that over on the right-hand side, which is the one on psilocybin, that is a very interesting state of awareness, because we know now, empirically, that this state of awareness can be used for problem solving, it can be used for healing, it can be used for transformation, it can be used for ecstasy and for insight. And those things are things that our culture could really, really do with now, couldn't it? You think? I mean, sure, as individuals, we aspire to this stuff, but as a community, this would probably be a really, really good thing to do. So as magicians, we can add to this debate because we can be talking about how we are able to, we are experienced in working with spirits. And what we also know is that as people are using these substances for therapeutic activity, that I'm talking with one of the people at the moment who in Britain is doing Mdma Psychotherapy. So they're doing Mdma Psychotherapy with people with chronic alcoholism. And as far as I can, I'm offering my experience as a magician, because what those therapists are encountering is phenomena which looks much more like spirit encounters. Frankly, the stuff you'd expect with Ayahuasca, they're encountering with MDMA. Yeah, so I'm able to say, well, look, we magicians, we spend little time worrying about, is it real? Is it in my head? Is it outside? It's just an encounter with a spirit, yeah? We can kind of leave it like that. We as magicians will be interested in having like autonomy on these spaces. So whilst we may want the medical opportunity to use psychedelics, we would probably also want our own personal, spiritual, our collective, and indeed our recreational use of these substances. These substances may also have a really broad benefit in terms of our culture. So these are some pictures from the temple at Eleusis. Remember Aleister Crowley, when he starts to do these rituals of people, these public psychedelic rituals, he decides that he's going to take the idea of the Alexanian Mysteries as one of his motifs. So the Alexanian Mysteries, briefly for those who are unfamiliar with it, was the principal initiation of the ancient world. Anyone who spoke Greek and hadn't committed murder could go to this temple and be initiated into the mystery of the goddess Demeter, the goddess of the grain. It was a long ritual in September, which ended up with people going through an experience, 3,000 of them at a time in the Telesterion, the big temple, where they would be taken in and they would be subjected to noise and smoke and craziness, having first taken the kykeon, which was a magical potion. Who knows, perhaps it had mushrooms in it. That's why there was the ancient prohibition against taking them, because they were sacred to this one site that seemed to have a psychedelic heart. Perhaps they were made from some substance that grew on grain, just like the precursor for LSD does. But either way, people were taken through this initiation. All sorts of people. People would save up all year and go to the temple, and or for their lifetime, like the Hajj, yeah, for Muslims. They would save up through their whole life and they would go. Or if they were wealthy, they may go several times. This was a psychedelic initiation. You went through this dark, compressed space, and just like all initiations, then you were emerged into the light. And the people who'd taken the kykeon were so impressed by this that for over 1,000 years, hardly anyone wrote anything down about this initiation. We only have poetic stories. I beheld the sun at midnight. I took this kykeon, I realized that there was no death. The people who went through this initiation were, as well as the everyday folk, all of the bankers and all of the emperor would go through there, the philosophers, all of the top people. Yeah? So all the people who are the decision makers, one might say, all the elite of culture, as well as Joe Public, would be sat together going through this experience, which is a psychedelic one. And I think that made a real difference to our culture, because I think that might have been really, really helpful. Let's briefly understand that one of the things that psychedelic substances are used to help for people is things like addiction. And when the doors to Eleusis closed in 400 AD, our culture, European culture, then became really sick, and eventually managed to become addicted to things like tobacco and cocaine and opium, all the uppers and downers, and the psychedelic heart dropped out of our culture, and it wasn't till the 20th century that we rediscovered that. So I kind of figure that as magicians, as occultists, what we can do is we can be working with this emerging psychedelic discourse, and we have stuff that we can throw in there that might be helpful for people. Because magic is all very well when you're kind of, in your circle, in your lodge, in your group, doing your thing. And you might do all sorts of spells to try and affect the wider world. And I would suggest that some of the spells that we should do should be for the liberation of the psychedelic gnosis. So the liberation of this ability to autonomously change awareness and create environments in which awareness can be changed for the benefit of ourselves and others, and that we should be contributing partners to that. I think it's really important that we do this because, as I understand it, the ice caps are melting, and as I understand it, some crazy dude has just been elected in Brazil, and as I understand it, Donald Trump is still in office, and as I understand it, Brexit is apparently happening, whatever the fuck that means. If these substances can heal us at an individual level, perhaps they could help heal us at a cultural level. As magicians, we have something to say about that. Yeah? I think that we have a way of helping with that. However we do it, and whether or not we use psychedelics in our own practice doesn't really matter, because our skills of creating ritual environments, of setting intentions, of working internally, of navigating the experience of interacting with apparently external entities, we can use that to help this story. Because this story could help us solve problems, and it could help the healing of the whole of our culture. Yeah? A single addict goes to my friend who's doing the Mdma Psychotherapy because they can't stop drinking, and they've kept drinking for 20 years. They go through Mdma Psychotherapy, and my friend is able to contact me as a magician and say, hey, let's talk about what they're experiencing so we can all understand how we can help people better. You know, I think that's a really valuable use of magic, and I'm sure all of us have the opportunity to do things like that. So we can transform the world, and to quote the great magician Bill Hicks, we can get on with the really important business of exploring inner and outer space together forever. Thank you very, very much for listening. I really appreciate your attention.